May I have your permission to speak from here?
Yeah, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I think it's a very important...
No more talking now. You made your point. Everybody was listening. Now you listen, please.
I think it's vital for us to understand the role of commerce and industry in charting India's economic destiny. Because the fact is that we all know our overwhelming objective as a country is to pull our people out of poverty, to help India grow and develop, to enhance the opportunities and chances available to Indian people. And for this, frankly, India is required to engage economically with the rest of the world, which is what commerce is. And at the same time, we have to enhance our industrial production. We have to employ more people in industry. And that is the other half of the ministry we're discussing today. So I think it's very important that we see how fundamental the work of the Ministry of Commerce and Industry is to the development and the future and the destiny of our country. Now, if we look at commerce first, we have to admit that at one time we were somewhat protectionist. This was a legacy of our nationalist movement. We knew the British East India Company had come to trade but stayed on to rule. And so we were suspicious initially of foreign trade. We put up the protectionist barriers. We went down from about 2.6% of global trade in 1947 to 0.2% in 1991. But with the opening up of our economy in 1991, the pace of liberalization and globalization, we were able to see a very interesting change in the picture. In the 1990s and in the first part of the last decade, the world economy and world trade grew at an unprecedented pace, a pace unprecedented in human history. And this created favorable conditions, external conditions, for our own country's growth. We enhanced our trade relations. We climbed back up towards 2% of global trade. We continue to climb. And the increase in our foreign trade has been fundamental to our improved rates of growth as an economy in India in the last few years. But at the same time, if we have to look at the context, since 2008, the world has been plunged into the worst financial and economic crisis since the Great Depression of the 1930s. We have weathered it well. There are many reasons, and I don't want to go into them in great detail, but we did certainly have wise fiscal policies conducted by our Reserve Bank of India. We had a stimulus package by the UPA government amounting to some 3% of GDP if you take the three stimulus packages together. Our manufacturing exports went down, as everybody's did during the recession, but our services exports went up. And it's also true that about 80% of our GDP growth, frankly, depends on the domestic sector, on Indians producing goods and services for other Indians. And that was sustained as well. And as I've mentioned in this House before, the extraordinary level of remittances from our hardworking NRIs abroad continued to go up, and that again has been a strength for us. But we have to acknowledge that even if we have weathered this recession, the external environment is no longer so propitious for our growth. The developed world is still reeling from the crisis. 44.5 million jobs were lost just in the OECD countries. The purchasing power of these economies is therefore down, and they are less able to purchase our goods. To give you one example, India's trade share with Europe and America. In 2001, it was 42.5%, our trade share. Today, 2011-12, it has gone down to 30.8%. Why? Because they don't have the resources to buy our goods. And this is something that we have to understand. There was a decline at one point. I think our Honourable Minister will remember this. When he became Minister, in the preceding year, from mid-2008 to 2009, there had been a 39.6% decline in India's exports. So this is the climate in which our Ministry of Commerce and Industry is facing the challenge of growth in our foreign trade. Now, they have adopted a multi-pronged strategy, providing a stable policy regime, adopting conscious market diversification, and providing additional support to the sectors that have been badly hit by global recession. There's an integrated foreign trade policy for the first time, a policy initiative to double exports and trade share by 2014. You know, as against the first target of $200 billion by 2010-11, we achieved $246 billion in exports. The target for the last fiscal year, if you look at last year's report, was $300 billion. In fact, we achieved, we should say, as a country, $303 billion. So I must congratulate the Minister and the Ministry for having been able to consistently exceed the targets they have set. However, it is also true, and I must admit this from the Honourable Opposition Member who spoke, that our imports have increased to $488 billion, which has given us the highest ever trade deficit of $185 billion. But this is due mainly to the near doubling of the international price of crude oil. The opposition could not control that. We could not control it. It rose from an average of about $65 a barrel in 2010 to $115 a barrel in 2011. And there was also the rise in the price of gold, which we continue to import in vast quantities. I'm sure that our ladies are partly accountable for this. Some $62 billion of gold were imported. All of this will inevitably have an impact on our import-export balance. Even pulses, edible oil, these commodities have gone up, and we have to import them for our people. And I think the only solution is what the minister is recommending, which is that to improve this, to cut back on this deficit, we have to improve our exports. The ministry has envisaged a target of $500 billion by 2014, and we have to admit this will not be possible unless Indian exporters enter new markets and expand along the product value chains. I mentioned that the US and the European markets are now about 30% of our Indian exports. We have to be able to deal with their financial downturn. These established markets are no longer as friendly to us. Our exporters need to be encouraged to retain their market share, but to add and expand their value-added products. Now, the government has stepped in, and I want to commend the ministry for this. Indian exporters are being given new incentives to explore new markets through what's called the Focus Market Scheme, to export specific products to the Focus Product Scheme. The market-linked Focus Product Scheme incentivizes exporters to place specific products in specific markets, and we have now diversified exports into 41 new markets, mainly in Latin America and Africa, which were relatively unexplored territories before. I hope the minister shall retain these schemes in the upcoming foreign trade policy and include more products and more markets in these schemes. Technology is also an important factor, defining the competitiveness of our exporters. The zero-duty export promotion capital goods scheme has helped exporters of products such as engineering goods, textiles, pharmaceuticals. It was mentioned by the opposition member. They have all upgraded their production facilities under the scheme. However, the scheme expired on the 30th of March this year, and keeping in mind the ministry's ambitions and targets, I certainly recommend that the scheme be further extended at least until 2014. If I may add, Mr. Chairman, we certainly need more and not fewer free trade agreements, if I may disagree with the opposition member. Concluding the long drawn-out negotiations with the European Union on a broad-based trade and investment agreement and with the Gulf Cooperation Council countries on an FTA are indispensable. I know that progress has been made with the Europeans. We just received a European Parliamentary delegation this week. The minister speaks of concluding this before the end of the year. Some of the problems are not from our side. The Europeans are insisting on certain elements being mentioned in the agreement that are not acceptable to a self-respecting nation. There are things we do ourselves. We don't need somebody else to put this into a trade agreement. But I'm sure that Europe will see reason as we continue to negotiate effectively. I think we clearly need more assertive diplomatic action on non-tariff barriers in certain markets, which are preventing Indian exports. I mean, let me take China as an example. China has been mentioned by others, but not in this debate. The India-China bilateral trade has hit a record $73.9 billion last year. But the ballooning trade deficit in Beijing's favor has risen to over $27 billion. While India's exports went up, exports to China went up over 12% over the previous year, Chinese exports to India crossed 23.5%, reaching $50 billion, which is a staggering growth over 2010. Now, they are welcome to export to us, but our trade deficit is growing and can only be reduced if our exporters are able to sell more to that country. Access for Indian IT goods and services, pharmaceuticals and other products remains severely restricted. And I call upon the minister and I call upon the government to increase the urgency and determination with which it speaks to China on this subject. At the same time, I again disagree with the honourable member. I would like to commend the minister and the government for expanding our economic cooperation agreements looking eastward. With ASEAN, with the 6 additional countries going up to the Pacific Ocean. The honourable member asked, what is the impact? I'll tell you, sir, what the impact is. Exports to ASEAN are up by 30% since the free trade agreement was concluded. After a similar agreement with South Korea, it's up by 38%. The policy has proved its worth and should be applauded by this House. A new development, which was not mentioned by the honourable member, has been the recent breakthrough in trade with Pakistan. I'd like to commend the Minister and the Government of India for this initiative. Pakistan has, as you know, expanded its list of tradable items with India, moving over from a small positive list of permitted goods. Only a few goods were permitted for them to trade with us. And now they've moved to a small negative list of banned goods, which is exactly the opposite approach. On our part, we have, of course, operationalized integrated checkposts at the Wagah-Atari border. This will give a boost to land cargo movement. It should create enormous trade opportunities, especially for the border states of Punjab, Haryana, Himachal Pradesh. I hope additional posts are opened, for example, in the Hussainiwala area. For 17 years, we had extended our hand. Since the days of Prime Minister Gujral, a one-sided most favoured nation agreement was offered by us. We gave them that status, they did not reciprocate. Finally, they have come to meet us halfway. And I think it is now our turn to be helpful, and we too, Mr. Minister, should be perhaps a little more generous on some of our non-tariff barriers, make it easier for their goods to get through into our country. And I'd like to, in this context, welcome the special thrust on enhancing our economic engagement with the SAARC countries in our neighbourhood. We have taken major steps to strengthen the border infrastructure, including the construction of state-of-the-art land customs facilities for easy movement of cargo over the land routes. 3 land customs stations have been created along the Indo-Bangladesh border. They'll be completed by the end of this year. And our neglected northeastern states can also revive further with freer trade across land borders. And I would really commend the ministry on this and urge them to expand this constructive policy. The Honourable Member mentioned special economic zones. You know, we have 153 special economic zones that are functioning, employing nearly 9 lakh people. All these SEZs together account for less than a third of India's exports. But in my view, it's not that there are too many. I would argue they are not enough. Formal approvals have actually been granted for setting up 583 special economic zones, of which 380 have been notified, but only these 153 are operational. Exports from the SEZs initially did very well. 43.1% growth in 2010-11, 121% growth in 2009-10. But what have we seen last year? Growth of only 15.4%. This is disappointing, and this is, to my mind, something the ministry has to pay attention to, but perhaps not only this ministry, because the decline in growth has been steeper last year after the imposition of the minimum alternate tax and the dividend distribution tax in the budget of 2011-12. Because what's happening is, if you impose more taxes, the net income tax benefit in the SEZs is less compared to promotional benefits like focus market and focus product schemes that the Ministry of Commerce is giving to units outside the SEZs. Consequently, no new investment is happening. And the units that have already got permission are reluctant to start operations because of the lack of enough incentives. So I would urge the Ministry of Commerce to sit down with the Ministry of Finance and try and do something about this. Otherwise, our SEZs are not likely to fulfill our legitimate ambitions for them. Even exports from the SEZs have come down as a proportion of total merchandise exports from the country. It used to be over 30% in the preceding years. Last year, it was only 26.7%. And when you look at China, so much of their economic success has been a result of what they've been able to do through their SEZs. We should at least see if others are prospering through this route, why can't we do so as well? And then if they want to sell in the domestic market, they have to pay a very high duty. Maybe we should find some flexible approach, Mr. Minister. Attempt, for example, to allow them to cater to domestic markets on the payment of a reasonable but requisite tax. This could also boost FDI in the SEZs, so they could do that. Investors are looking for access to the Indian markets, and we could use this to our advantage. It has to be said that our transaction costs remain a problem. Transaction costs in our economy are about 7 to 10% of our country's exports. That is really astonishing. Exporters and importers are spending between $13 to $18 billion a year on transaction-related costs, which makes our exports uncompetitive. Let's be honest. Effective steps have to be taken to reduce these costs. I read one report which said that the cost of exporting a container from India is $1,055. Importing to India is $1,025, whereas in Singapore, the similar cost is $456 to export, $439 to import. Now, I know that a task force was set up by the Minister on transaction costs and exports. I think the Minister of State was in charge of that. I'm very pleased to see him here. The task force identified issues across 7 ministries, and I believe a majority of these are being implemented. So I do want to commend both ministers for their work in this. The task force also recommended a scheme for direct electronic credit of service tax refund for exporters, and this, I think, will make a very positive difference. The honourable member mentioned the assistance given by the central government to the states to develop their infrastructure. But I must say I was a bit confused by his statement. On the one hand, he said there is not enough money. On the other hand, he said, please don't spend their surplus balance. If there is not enough money, how do they have a surplus balance? Clearly, resources are being provided to the states, and the fact is that this will have a direct impact on reducing the logistical burden and on so reducing transaction costs. The government's efforts to streamline paperwork, reduce the number of separate applications, and increase the use of electronic processes and clearances should be commended by this House. In fact, I was saying that just last month, there was an excellent facility introduced to enable banks to post payments received data for exporters directly on the website of the Directorate General for Foreign Trade. Now, you don't have exporters running around, to access their bank realization certificates that are needed for clearing export incentives and so on. They can access them online, they can file their claims. And I think this kind of e-governance initiative, which this House has always stood behind, should be promoted in the future as well. Export credit, of course, is very important. The fact is that the interest subvention, which was mentioned by the honourable member, of 2% on rupee credit, expired in March this year. I hope it will be extended, and I would request the minister to consider this, keeping in mind the credit needs of exporters. And of course, banks are required to reach a level of outstanding export credit that is equivalent to about 12% of their adjusted net bank credit. But given how vital exports are to the growth of our economy, the share of export credit should be enhanced. And again, I realize that goes beyond the remit of this ministry, but it's worth pursuing. The honourable member mentioned agricultural exports. I think we have to accept that there is a need to improve our exports of agricultural goods and marine products, which together accounted for about 81,600 crores in 2010-11. That's over $16 billion. The agriculture sector in India suffers from a low level of commercialization, low productivity by any global standards, weak market orientation, and of course the lack of infrastructure that we have all bemoaned. India has also lagged behind in investing in the agriculture and retail sectors. So we need to move towards what in the West they call a farm-to-fork retail supply system. There was a World Bank study of India which showed that the average price that the farmer receives for a typical agricultural or horticultural product is only 12 to 15% of the price the consumer pays at the retail outlet. In other words, when you buy your sabzi at the bazaar, you are paying 8 times more for the same tomato or potato than the farmer got. That is a serious problem we have here. Trade liberalization in the agricultural sector has to be initiated in a phased manner, and the priority must first be to increase investment in order to create a holistic solution to this sector. The plantation sector was also mentioned. I agree with the honourable member, we need to strengthen exports of rubber, spices, tea and coffee. But I would say the ministry is taking the right steps. So I would actually use the same argument in favour of the minister and not as a criticism, because it's an important provider of employment and contributor to exports. Over 2 million people are employed in our plantation sector. More than 4 million people derive their livelihood from associated activities in the production value chain. And, the fact is there is resistance. Resistance is from the developed countries whose agriculture is so expensive because of the higher wages there that they subsidize their agriculture lavishly. In fact, in Europe, Mr. Chairman, agricultural subsidies are so high that there would be enough to pay for every cow in Europe to fly business class around the world. Now, that is the kind of challenge we are facing when we try to export our agricultural products. The ministry must support our farmers. Let me turn, Mr. Chairman, to the other half of the ministry, industry. Manufacturing is obviously on everyone's mind. It accounts for about 16% of our GDP. And I know I mentioned China a fair bit. Just to give you a context, in China, it's 34% of their GDP that comes from manufacturing. Now, the government's objective, according to the ministry, is to raise this to 25% by 2020. That is a tall order. But the Ministry of Commerce and Industry is taking a number of positive steps in this direction. We must remember that manufacturing is essential to create more jobs. Manufacturing employs people, and we all know, around the world, if I can say this, that there is nothing more dangerous than unemployed young men. If you want to look at why our Maoists and Naxalites are picking up guns, it's because they don't have jobs available to them. We need to create more labor-intensive opportunities for them, and that is why manufacturing is so important. Now, in the demand for grants of the ministry, a provision of 1 crore rupees has been provided for the scheme for implementation of the national manufacturing policy. This is the new thing. This whole initiative of the ministers to create a national manufacturing policy must be commended. It is a model for many other countries, certainly many developing countries, perhaps even some developed ones. It aims to create 100 million jobs in our country and contribute 25%, of course, to our country's GDP in a decade. The most important aspect of this policy is that it seeks to establish national investment and manufacturing zones. And these zones will basically be industrial townships of at least 5,000 hectares in size with world-class infrastructure. 7 of these townships have already been notified. More are needed, though I must say, coming from Kerala, that I suspect that my state will never be able to find 5,000 hectares, and I hope the ministry will consider some modest dilution of these numbers for states where greater pressure on land is there, as in my case. The policy also has been able to show due respect for environmental concerns, workers' rights, regulatory issues, and I must say that the fact that they did an impact study before notifying these zones was very important. I'm sure the Ministry of the Environment is very happy with this. Another welcome development in these zones is that they're mainly on non-agricultural land, wasteland, shrubland. And this means that we're not taking this away, as the Honourable Member alleged, from productive, rich, fertile farmland. At the same time, ownership is going to be with the state government, so that the state government should be able to acquire such lands where they exist. This means, of course, it will be easier in Rajasthan or Madhya Pradesh than in Kerala. That's part of life for us. We have to accept that. But that's where these lands are more easily available. I worry a little bit about what one might call the Fatehpur Sikri problem. You remember you built a beautiful town in Fatehpur Sikri and then discovered there was not enough water for the people there. But the Ministry of Commerce and Industry has paid attention to this issue. They have conducted feasibility studies to ensure there is enough water in each of these 7 new townships coming up, and the use of modern technology for this purpose is to be applauded. The best example of this new policy, I must say, and the new thinking, is the Delhi-Mumbai Industrial Corridor. India will now, thanks to this, have the world's largest infrastructure project in history. Its spine is a 1,500-kilometer long dedicated railway freight corridor, and the whole project covers 42% of India's landmass. 6 states are affected. It is estimated to attract an investment of around 90 to 100 billion dollars. That's rupees 5 lakh crores. We're talking something of a gigantic scale of ambition over the next 30 years, that is. And this could employ easily 3 million people. On top of that, it's a 21st century concept. There's green technology, eco-cities are being dreamt of, innovation, new townships are coming up. The Japanese government has come in with major funding. When the Prime Minister was here in December, he said that Japan would contribute $4.5 billion for this. So we are really looking at an extraordinary venture, and I hope this House will take an interest in the Delhi-Mumbai Industrial Corridor and support it over the years ahead. It is going to be a shining star of our country's accomplishments in this area. Now, the policy talks about achieving real annual growth of about 12 to 14% in the sector. It comes at a much needed time because, let's face it, the share of manufacturing in our country's GDP has remained rather flat for the last decade. In 1999-2000, it was 15%, 15.1%. In 2004-05, it was 15.3%. In 2009-10, it was 16%. And that's pretty flat. And that simply will not do, because if you look at the historical pattern in countries that are transitioning from overwhelming dependence on agriculture to becoming more industrial societies, the growth has been much faster than that. And therefore, I think we should not criticize, as the Honourable Opposition Member did, the Minister for his higher target. This is a target we must aspire to in the interest of our own country's future and our own country's development. We can keep setting up investment zones and SEZs, but we will not be able to achieve this target until we really appreciate the underlying reasons for the slow growth in manufacturing. First of all, it's too highly resource intensive in our country. The value added after accounting for material costs, fuel costs, royalty is less than 20% of the output value, whereas in the US it's 54%, Germany 33%, even China has a 29% value added. So where material costs are rising in our present scenario, remaining competitive is going to be a major challenge for our exporters. And this is only in the organized sector I'm talking about. In the unorganized sector, the value addition is even lower. Fuel inputs, for example, in our country account for 5 to 7% of the value of output in India. Fuel costs so much for us, whereas in the US it's only 2%. The rising fuel prices, consequent taxes, all this add to the problems of our industries, and I'm conscious that the government is aware of this problem and is moving forward to deal with it. The policy, of course, as I mentioned, speaks about creating 100 million new jobs. Again, this is so necessary because the prevailing trend in the manufacturing sector is the opposite. According to the National Sample Survey, 66th round, an estimated 2.7 million jobs have been lost to manufacturing, and this has been mainly in the unorganized sector. So our growth has been mainly, we have been growing in employment, but it's been mainly in the services sector and frankly in the construction industry, since there has been a construction boom around the country. The total employment in manufacturing is just short of 53 million. So we have a huge, huge challenge ahead of us, because 80% of this 53 million is itself in the unorganized sector, and we only have about 11 million workers in the organized sector. Labor rigidity is a huge problem. It's ironic that in a labor surplus society like ours, we should have this problem. This House has to bite the bullet of reforming labor laws, because our laws today protect the jobs that already exist, rather than providing incentives to create new jobs. And we will have to face this sooner or later. Another point is that wages in organized manufacturing have remained rather stagnant. Average growth of real output was 12.7% between 2005 to 8, whereas growth in wages was only 1%. We need to encourage workers to be paid better and more fairly in our industry. And at the same time, our technologists, our engineers, should be paid on a par with managers. Because if you want to use high technology effectively, you need to attract technologists into manufacturing. But I want to conclude on that point, Mr. Chairman, by saying that the national manufacturing policy is an excellent initiative for which this House should really commend the Minister and the Ministry. And the target of growth and employment generation is much needed, but we have to be conscious it will take a great deal of work, especially to attract foreign investment into this sector. And this is why I want to talk briefly about foreign direct investment, which was mentioned by the Honourable Opposition Member. First of all, we should applaud the Minister for simplifying and rationalising FDI policy. In the past, investors had to go through 178 different press notes, RBI guidelines and so on, to figure out what the investment policy of India was. Now we have one single FDI policy document, updated annually. I think that's an excellent innovation. I'd like to commend the Minister for that. And he has had other innovations like the so-called India shows. 11 of them have been conducted around the world, showcasing India as an investment destination in a number of key countries. However, FDI has been going down significantly in the last few years, plunging to $19 billion in the 2010-11 fiscal year, even though it rose again to about $25 billion last year. Investors, frankly, need a stable policy environment. Developments like the retroactive tax introduced in the current budget, obstacles raised by environmental clearances which have held up major investment projects in Orissa and elsewhere, rescinding of previously granted approvals, these have happened, and these are all problematic. Ad hoc policy changes, like the sudden imposition of export controls on cotton and then its withdrawal, can convey confusing signals to both exporters and to investors.